landscape overall within consulting has changed quite a bit. Just the way that, well, people and permission is still key to consulting 100%. But I think just the way that you now have the technology component, you have the managed services component, and just the different ways that vendors are approaching the engagements and how they're using it. How consulting is relevant to companies now is a little different than I think it used to be.
Welcome to TBR Talks, decoding strategies and ecosystems of the globe's top tech firms, where we talk business model disruption in the broad technology ecosystem, from AWS to SAP, AT&T to Verizon, and Intel to NVIDIA. We'll be answering some of the key intelligence questions we've heard from executives and business unit leaders among the leading IT and telecom vendors and services firms. I'm Patrick Heffernan, Principal Analyst, and today we'll go from BCG to Wipro with Kelly Lesiczka, Senior Analyst for TBR's Management Consulting practice. Kelly, you have been working on the management consultancy, so the big four firms plus McKinsey, Bain, and BCG for a long time now. And I'm curious if there are certain mega trends or certain things about their business models or their strategies or the way they go to market that have changed significantly over the last couple of years.
Yeah, so looking at a lot of the things they were focused on a few years ago, I think their approach to technology has shifted quite a bit. I think at the beginning of 2020, and definitely guided by the pandemic, they more or less figured out how they were going to figure out how to integrate technology and approach it with like PwC products and building out product offerings and businesses. I think that kind of was a big focus a few years ago, but more or less now they've figured out how they want to do it. So looking at a company like IBM, they were very tech heavy before, so they always had that technology edge. Whereas the consultancies, they were focusing more on building it through their partnerships and ecosystems, so kind of creating a different way to their ecosystems and bringing in different companies that they weren't. I think EY is a pretty good example because they always had partnerships, but I think through their technology investments, they've created a stronger emphasis on them and bringing them in. But then also how the vendors have kind of aligned themselves with a select. Like, you obviously need to be familiar with the companies, but building themselves closely with another. So like EY's relationship with Microsoft, for example, so how they're closely aligning with a vendor in particular so that they can kind of scale the offerings around there. And I think just the landscape overall within consulting has changed quite a bit. Just the way that, well, people and permission is still key to consulting 100%. But I think just the way that you now have the technology component, you have the managed services component, and just the different ways that vendors are approaching the engagements and how they're using it. How consulting is relevant to companies now is a little different than I think it used to be.
Yeah, I think we go back 7 or 8 years and we think about technology. Although that was beginning to become super important within the management consulting space, it was still just a piece of it,
right? And
not the highest value piece either. And then managed services was something we didn't even talk about at all.
No, I think the vendors had it, but it was never labeled as managed services. That was something that they always had the capability of the services, but I don't think it was quite scaled or packaged in that sort of way until more recently.
Right. So that's one part of what you do. Another part of what you do is you look at companies, broader IT services companies, in particular HCL Tech and Fujitsu, who I think of as being sort of quietly successful. So what is it that those two companies do that makes them, am I right to say they're quietly successful?
I think that's the perfect way to describe them, actually. Yeah, I think Fujitsu, they have such a strong base in Japan. I think a lot of times they are overlooked because it's like, oh, they're not necessarily my competitor because they're so heavy there. But I think they are very strong around like their hardware capabilities, and then also with the way they've moved out around quantum capabilities and AI. They're very strong in a lot of those areas, and I think a big part of that is their innovation network within Japan, the way that they're able to work with the local universities, the research academia, and the institutions like that. And they're also able to test a lot of their solutions. So that's something I don't necessarily see from a lot of the other IT services peers, is the trials that they conduct on these technologies and the different solutions. So I think for them, that's definitely a leg up, and other companies may not necessarily think about that or think twice, but I think for them, it really gives them more of an edge. They just don't necessarily have the scale overseas, which is probably why people tend to overlook. But I think they still have a lot of those strong capabilities. And despite being so heavily based in Japan, they are still quite large compared to some of the other IT services.
Right.
Yeah. HCL too, I think as well. More recently, I think they're trying to kind of build the brand and reputation. I know they've had a few partnership sponsorship agreements with Ferrari, and there was one other one as well, but like they're using that. MetLife Stadium.
Oh, right.
So they're trying to build themselves a bit bigger in the U.S. particularly too, because they, like you said, they were quiet before. So I think kind of making that splash helps them to build their recognition around.
Yeah, and do you imagine that we're going to get to a point where there'll be more cooperation between those two kinds of companies, like an HCL Tech and an EY, or a PwC and a Fujitsu? Is that coming? Is that a natural evolution of the ecosystem, or do they do what they do well and they're just going to stay in their lanes?
I think it could be beneficial to them. I know they have the heavy partnerships and business units tied to Google, for example, and Microsoft. So I think working with a consultancy could help them, especially as they have that deep engineering expertise. I think pairing with that would be helpful. But then again, when you look at PwC and their partnership with DXC, it didn't quite pan out, I think, as either one of them had hoped. But I think if they were to partner in a more effective way, combining those two, like the engineering piece, especially tied to how some of them are looking to build out products. HCL had integrated the IBM software products, so I think combining that with some of the consultancies partnerships or products that could be quite beneficial to, I think, both of them.
Right. And I'm glad you brought up PwC and DXC, because that was a while ago, so I'm sure both firms have learned, well, the company DXC and then the firm PwC have learned lessons. All right, so one final question. You've been doing this for almost 10 years, I think. Is that right?
So.
Okay.
I think 7.
And mostly looking at the same group of companies. So I'm curious, when you think about the IT services space and the management consulting space, what is the one or two questions that you've never been able to get an answer to? You think like, I wish I knew this about these companies or about this market.
Yeah. That's a good question. I think kind of like, I hate to use Gen AI as an example, but I think the way that HCL approached Gen AI, they kind of saw beyond the hype of it and they looked at it more rationally and more sensibly. So how companies kind of decide what they're going to like double down on, like we were talking about the metaverse and how it kind of fell apart of it, or it's not as big of an area, but like if you were to invest so heavily in that, what would spur you to do that as opposed to putting all your eggs in this other basket? Like, I think just the way that they choose what to double down on, and depending on how it necessarily fits within the portfolio, a lot of companies will still choose to build it just because, that's what their clients want or that's what they need to do to keep ahead. So how do they make that decision, and how do they decide to really go forward with a different technology like that?
Yeah, the management consultancies in particular are good at helping other companies make strategic bets. So how are they making
How do they do it themselves?
Right, yeah. That's going to be, I think, an ongoing question. So Excellent. Thank you very much, Kelly.
Yeah, thank you.
Next month, I'll be speaking with Kelly Lesiczka again, talking about the key intelligence questions we'll be getting over this coming month. Next week, I'll be speaking about digital marketing services in the Gen AI era with Boz Hristov. Don't forget to send us your key intelligence questions on business strategy, ecosystems, and management through the form in the show notes below. Visit tbri.com to learn how we help tech companies large and small answer these questions with the research, data, and analysis my guests bring to this conversation every week. Once again, I'm your host, Patrick Heffernan, Principal Analyst at TBR. Thanks for joining us, and see you next week.